Hi everyone, today we are going to be focused on 5th grade lesson 37 of the Elevate curriculum. This lesson requires us to understand fractions as multiples as well as multiplying a fraction by a whole number. You might be saying to yourself, Miss Achia, we have done this for 2 days. Correct. However, by the end of this lesson, students are going to be required to demonstrate mastery around finding the product of a fraction and a whole number without using any models. So no fraction strips, no number lines, okay? The first part of this lesson is a bit of review, however. For instance, they are asking us to show 5/3 using a fraction model. So as you can see, here is one model that has been partitioned into thirds because our unit is in thirds, and they want us to shade 5 parts. So once we shade 1, 2, and 3 parts, we notice that we have no more parts to shade. So what is necessary is for us to draw another fraction model that is partitioned into thirds and then go about shading the remaining 2. Another way that we can show 5/3 is as the sum of unit fractions. So 1/3 plus 1/3 plus 1/3 plus 1/3 plus 1/3 gives us 5/3. And then the last way that we can represent 5/3 is by saying that 5 times 1/3 is equal to 5/3, right? So we know that repeated addition is related to multiplication. So instead of you saying 1/3 plus 1/3 plus 1/3 plus 1/3 plus 1/3, you can say 1/3 times 5 or 5 times 1/3, okay? So typically we would say that you should start with a teacher model of one of the first questions that have been identified within the lesson, which would be this one. However, I would say release students to maybe 2 minutes of independent time to grapple with this question just to see what they have mastered from previous days, because as we said, this lesson is a bit of a review. So shade unit fractions to show 5/4. So students will have to identify, okay, what is a unit fraction, right? And then they would have to figure out how many times they need to show that unit fraction in order for them to get 5/4. So a question that you can ask to support them if they're struggling to identify what the unit fraction is, you can ask them, well, what unit is being identified in the fraction 5/4, right? And then how many times should we shade 1/4, once they say 1/4, to model 5/4, right? So then they can say, okay, well, 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4, oh, this is an error, this should say is equal to 5/4. And then if you want to push them even further, you can ask them, what is the correlating multiplication sentence to this repeated addition, okay? And then this other piece, again, you can model it or you can allow students to grapple with it. We touched on this a little bit, I think, in lesson 35. This is just the different ways that we can write 3 times 3/4. We can write this multiplication sentence also as a unit fraction times a whole number, right? So students can identify that 3 times 3 is equal to 9. Well, there are 9 of those fourths that need to be shaded. So the unit fraction multiplication sentence that we would write is 9 times 1/4. And so then you would model this piece as well to show them that correlation. I would say you definitely want to model this question for students for this lesson, only because you want to show them, you want to stamp the learning that you can write that there are supposedly 5 groups of 2/3, or you can write that there are 10 groups of 1/3, and it's still going to give you the same answer. In the same way that you can say there are 3 groups of 3/4, or there are 9 groups of 1/4. it's the same. But you would have to stamp that learning for them because that is what they're going to be doing for majority of this lesson. So here is another question that you can model for them that touches on unit fractions, but then releasing them to 15 minutes of independent work time where they're saying, okay, well, 4/3, I know that the unit that we are going to be looking at is thirds. Great, it's already partitioned for students, amazing. Well, okay, 4 times 1/3 is going to give me 4/3, so I need to shade in 1/3 4 times, right? Second part asks them to identify the repeated addition statement that matches with this unit fraction. You can guide students to first write the fraction as a multiplication sentence and then transfer that down to repeated addition. And then it asks them to just write it as a unit fraction, okay? This question right here, question B, leaves a space for the denominator. So students already have learned that 6 times 2 is going to give them 12, and they know to keep the denominator of 5. However, with this question right here, it is trying to stamp that it's not that we're just ignoring the denominator of the 6 or that the 6 doesn't have a denominator. No, all whole numbers can be written as a fraction by putting that number over 1. So 1 is going to be a placeholder that you use for this question. And then, yeah, students are going to be required to find the product without using any models by the end of this lesson.